So last time we looked at what I think is the number one substantive criticism against Total War Pharaoh, and that's that the game is just way too small. Now, we talked about some reasons why the map covers the area that it does and why it cuts off where it does, and if you missed that, you can click on the screen somewhere, I think, to look at that video and see why I'm fairly optimistic and think that the idea of this just being a saga game is a bit misguided. But at the same time, I can totally understand the frustration here. Anyone who's a fan of the Bronze Age can't help but look at that map and mentally fill in the blanks and just sort of wonder why they're not there. However, for anyone who pre-orders the game at the maximum level, which is like $90 in the US, one of the perks that you get for that is that you're guaranteed a certain DLC. Specifically, 3 faction packs and a campaign pack. Now, what do we think about pre-ordering DLC before the game is even out? I won't get distracted with that, but what it does mean is that for all that I hope this game will do well, it might bomb. But even if it is a commercial failure, we're at least guaranteed a certain amount of expansions. So you and I, we're going to look over the world of the Bronze Age collapse and list all the possible ways that Creative Assembly could expand the world through new factions, new maps, and new DLC, in order of how likely I think any of these are. Then I'm going to rate each one on how likely it is to show up in the game, and on whether I think it would be a good addition, or really just how excited I am personally for it. Starting with the most likely and least surprising, I think we're almost guaranteed playable Sea Peoples in one of the faction packs. I mean, they already have all the assets for them, since the Sea Peoples are a major enemy in the game already, and one of the more recognizable factions of the Bronze Age collapse. And all it would take is for them to have something like the Horde or Nomad mechanics that we've seen in Total Warhammer or Total War Attila, and the start location would be on the edge of the map in a ship in the water. For faction leaders, it would be pretty intuitive to assume that one would be the Peliset, the most successful of the Sea Peoples who later settled and became the Philistines. Also, they've already featured those funny Peliset helmets pretty prominently, so they definitely are included as an enemy faction already. For the second, I assume it would be 2, because there's 2 Hittite leaders, 2 supposedly Canaanite leaders, so that's probably what's going to be in any faction packs. For the second leader, it could be literally any of the other Sea Peoples. The truth is, we know basically nothing about the rest of them concretely, aside from some examples of dress, some speculation on origin points, not much about the people themselves. If I had to guess, I would say the Shurden, mostly because they have an easy-to-pronounce name. But our ignorance here is great enough that they are all mostly interchangeable from a video game perspective. Now, the one strike against this pick is that there are no faction leader characters that we know of historically, but given how much they fleshed out Irsu from literally a single mention historically, they're fully capable of just making up some characters for this. Now, on the scale of 1 to cash grab, I do have to put this over on the cynical side of things. They have the art assets already. They have the faction's basic actions. All they really need to add in here is some flavor and campaign stuff to make them as interesting as the folks trying to be Pharaoh or Great King. But honestly, the Total War team already showed off Irsu quite proudly, despite him not actually participating in the main campaign mechanics. So maybe they'll just toss the Sea People in and charge us some money for it. It is a bit unfair to call it a pure cash grab, as there is a lot of potential that could be added in if they really wanted to. They could build a whole new campaign style for these guys. But at the same time, if they do go minimal with the Sea People, then there's really no reason for them not to be unlocked in the base game, except a desire to gate content behind cash. Still though, they're pretty much guaranteed to show up in one of the faction packs. The only question really is if they're going to be first or come a bit later. Overall, I give this a 10 of 10 for how likely it is, and a 6 of 10 for how excited I am for it. Now, the other faction that's extremely likely to show up in a faction pack is some flavor of Greeks. Now, historically, this is a little bit awkward because the Mycenaean Greeks pretty much collapsed 50 years earlier, but in all honesty, they could very easily fudge the timeline here, or they could say that a few pockets of the Mycenaeans haven't yet been completely overwhelmed. Now, the reason they might do this, as many internet commenters have pointed out, is that Total War Pharaoh uses a lot from the back end of the recent Total War Troy, which is set in Bronze Age Greece. Now, I think it's quite likely that they will bring the Greeks in some fashion, because Greeks in general are very recognizable and very popular, and they do fit into the era quite nicely. And when they do bring them in, I think it's inevitable that people are going to say CA is charging us for a copy-paste job. Now, this is unreasonable, even though I guarantee someone in the comments has already typed out, Pharaoh is just a Troy reskin. But actually, I would say if they do bring in the Greeks, it actually feels like less of a cash grab than the Sea Peoples would. Yes, they already have a lot of Greek assets from making Troy, but at the same time, it will take a decent amount of work to integrate those properly into the current game, which is more work than many non-experts assume. Programming is hard. That additional amount of work would balance out the price of the DLC, which I'm optimistically assuming will be modest and reasonable, because, of course, I know nothing at all about what's going on with the Warhammer DLC right now. Anyway, the biggest issue with the Greeks, though, is that there's a good chance they'll need to expand the map west in order to cover their homeland. And the part I'm worried about is that there's a good chance that the promised campaign pack will basically be just this map extension. For me, that would be extremely disappointing. I think I wouldn't be alone here in my disappointment either. Sure, there is a cool story in Greece around the Bronze Age collapse, especially if they take the somewhat older idea of a Doric invasion into Greece around this time, but it would also likely close off the possibility of a campaign pack focused around Mesopotamia, which, as a Mesopotamian history podcaster, is the thing I want to see more than anything. The best outcome for me would be a faction pack which also opens up that land without eating up a campaign pack along with it, because it really would be nice to have Greece and Western Anatolia included in the game. Overall, I'm give this a 9 of 10 for how likely it is to appear, and a 7 of 10 for how excited I am for it, although that does assume that it's well executed. Otherwise, this drops to like a 3 of 10 if this is just a missed opportunity. Now, moving out of the range of pretty much guaranteed and into the tier of moderately likely, I think the next most likely are some number of Phoenician city-states. On the map, the cities we see are Ugarit, Gubla, Sidon, and Sumer. Now, technically, Ugarit isn't Phoenician, and in fact, none of them are called that until the Greek period, and Ugarit didn't survive that long, so it'll be interesting to see if they call them Phoenician, or if they're going to call it a Canaanite expansion or something like that. Now, of those four coastal cities, Ugarit and Gubla are the most likely to be faction leaders here. Ugarit because it's famous for being an archaeological gold mine, and Gubla because that's the famous city of Byblos, which is what the Greeks called it. Not always the most powerful of cities, but definitely the oldest and most culturally significant. Being Canaanite, they already have a nice faction to fit into, and won't necessarily need significant mechanics added on, though that would be nice. And being already on the world map as minor factions means relatively little needs to be added in. There are, however, two reasons why these aren't at the top of the list. First is that Canaan is already kind of crowded, and though really the whole map is already pretty full, and these sorts of gameplay considerations are usually thought through pretty well by the Total War team. Perhaps more importantly, though, is that historically, these weren't military powers. They have no history of military expansion, and don't seem to have fought much beyond their local borders for self-defense and local gain. For the most part, these were maritime and commercial powers in a game that doesn't have a whole lot of economic depth, at least compared to the military aspect. Ugarit aside, these cities were major players in the region for well over 1,000 years, and in none of that time did they lead any significant military campaigns. Now, that historical issue may or may not play into the Total War team's thinking, but it should. And a Byblos or Ugarit campaign should have something to make it noticeably different from the major powers. Overall, I give the Phoenicians an 8 of 10 for how likely they are to appear, and a 5 of 10 for how excited I am, even though I do like the cities themselves, just maybe not in a purely military context. Moving down the list, I would say next most likely is some sort of Barbarians pack. This would be different from the Sea Peoples, but it could include Kaskans, the barbarians of northern Anatolia, Amorites, the barbarians of the Near Eastern Desert, and Libyans, the barbarians of North Africa. These would be either settled on the current map edge, or they might be hordes like maybe the Sea Peoples might be, or they could just open up one or two new provinces on the relevant edges for each of these guys. The campaign style would basically be like Ursu, but with different starting positions and different factional units. And they would be an important addition to the Bronze Age crisis that gets often overshadowed by the Sea Peoples, because these were often the guys that hit the hardest. They already have a regional unit system built in that incorporates a bit from various barbarian groups, so this would be mostly a matter of expanding those rosters a bit and hopefully finding some interesting niche to give them so that they're more than just Ursu clones. I would say that these are 7 of 10 likely to appear in some faction pack at some point, but frankly I'm only about 2 of 10 in my excitement here, since we already have Ursu and we're probably gonna have the Sea Peoples. How many playable barbarians do we really need? But maybe that's just me. Anyway, moving down the list, probably the most demanded faction inclusion is the Assyrians and Babylonians. And I include myself in that. I would very much like to see the Mesopotamian factions properly represented in a Total War game. That's my primary historical focus. See the link for a playlist just on the stuff I did in the Middle and Late Bronze Ages. Hopefully it's appearing. I'm not good with YouTube. But for all that I want these guys, they are halfway down the list for 2 pretty important reasons. First, On the game side, it will take either a wholly new map or a significantly expanded map to accommodate them. On that front, I'm extremely hopeful that the campaign pack will in fact be Mesopotamia focused rather than Greek or some other Western focused. At the same time, that's a lot of resources to put into a DLC which is pretty much guaranteed to generate a lot of controversy. On the resources side, I don't think that the development team is anything less than passionately committed. I think they would love to make all of these, but I do think that the corporate side of Creative Assembly, the one that prices DLC and underfunds QA, might be too stingy to put in for this. On the controversy side, judging from internet comments, there's going to be a lot of people very surprised by what they get in a game set in 1207 BCE. I've seen people expecting that a Mesopotamia expansion will include the Sumerians, who've been basically dead by 800 years at this point. I mean, for context, this is even more anachronistic than the people who want the Byzantine Empire to feature in Hearts of Iron, the World War II simulator. I've seen people who think that Hammurabi or his successors might show up in Babylon, or people that think that this will be the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar and the biblical captivity period. People think they'll be getting the terrifying and militarized Neo-Assyrian Empire, but if the Mesopotamia campaign pack starts in 1207, right at the death of Tukulti-Ninurta, meaning that all the drama of his reign has already passed, then the main faction leaders are going to be the incredibly recognizable household names of Adad-Shuma-Usur in Babylon and Ashur-nadin-apli in Assyria. These guys and their immediate successors ruled over a period of decline and obscurity, and frankly, this is the reason why they aren't in the game at start. By 1207, there's not any more interaction between Mesopotamia and the Levant. Trade has slowed to a trickle, and military logistics is weak enough that no power retains the ability to launch expeditions across the upper Euphrates River. And the decline in Mesopotamia is in many ways unrelated to the decline in the West. Yes, they have the same climate issues, but the particular barbarian and military threats are separate from the threats faced by Egypt and Anatolia. Historically speaking, Mesopotamia is not actually needed, and perhaps not even appropriate, to be included in a game that runs from 1207 to 1150, focused on Egypt and Anatolia. Now, for those of us who do want Babylon and Assyria included in a grand region-spanning map, they would need to change the start date. A good option here would be 1350, the start of the Amarna period, right as the world system of the Late Bronze Age is at its height. Now, if that's our scenario, then everything from Greece to southern Iran can and should get included, and great empires can struggle over a massive canvas. But realistically, we're not getting that, except as an expansion pack way down the road should Pharaoh prove to be vastly more successful than anticipated. If they keep the 1207 start date, Mesopotamia will be its own map, with its own constricted boundaries. And as much as people aren't going to like it, that's going to be historically appropriate for the chosen start year. Still, there is more possibility for this period than a lot of people realize. There are no dreams of Assyrian expansion or Babylonian glory at this point, but in Assyria, the long-lived and kind of successful Tukulti-Ninurta has just been assassinated, and we know of at least 3 people who may not have all gotten along, who take the kingship or are claimed as king in the following years. And though traditional narratives of this period don't actually see a civil war breaking out, it's total war. They could fudge things a bit on this account. Meanwhile, Babylon is coming off of a period of Assyrian occupation. So down in the south, supported by the Sutaean desert nomads and the people of the Sea Land, is Adad-shuma-usur. In the capital is an unnamed governor who was installed by the Assyrians, and perhaps in the east we could see the rise of the Bit-Haban Kassites in the Diyala region, who Nabuchodonosor would have to fight later during his Elamite invasion. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about here, that's fine. If this ever gets announced, I'm going to do some fantastic historical overviews. But all you really need to know is that this period does have plenty of space for around 5 to 8 faction leaders in a contained Mesopotamia-focused arena, and would be pretty great if well executed. Now, in terms of how excited I am for this, I rate it a 10 of 10. I'm honestly more excited to reconquer Babylon as Adad-shuma-usur than I am for any of the Egyptian faction leaders already announced. But in terms of how likely it is, I honestly think that it's maybe a 6 of 10 that will ever actually get this. Moving down the list and deeper into controversial territory, and also the more unlikely for various interesting reasons. First up, I think a Western Anatolia faction pack, plus a map expansion, would be absolutely fascinating. There are a number of mid-sized powers in the region at this time. Some, like the Seha Riverlands, are nominally Hittite, but perennially revolting, while others like Arzawa, Lucca, and of course Wilusa have fascinating histories. Plus, this is the route of entry for the people who later become the Phrygians, and the people who later become Urartu. So you do have the destruction dynamic of the rest of the Near East, but with smaller kingdoms who do actually have the potential to expand during this period. I could easily see a pack of 5 factions, maybe Proto-Phrygia with a lot of the Sea People or Barbarian mechanics, plus maybe Arzawa and Wilusa with some independent expansion mechanics, maybe Lucca as a sort of hybrid between settled and barbarian, and the Seha Riverlands as a Hittite Western hybrid. It has the potential to be the most diverse and interesting region in the whole game. And yet I see it overall is fairly unlikely. The first reason for this is, how would fans react if they expand the map to include West Anatolia, but not Greece? And if they do release Greece first, Western Anatolia has the potential to feel like a backwater, an undersell. That's related to the second and perhaps bigger reason. How many regular Total War fans are currently excited to play as the Seha Riverlands? How many are emotionally invested in Arzawa? How many even know that Wilusa already showed up in a previous Total War game? And how might they react when they find out which one? Western Anatolia, you see, is wretchedly obscure, even for an obscure time period. And can corporate types really put a serious investment into a region they themselves might not be able to find on a map? Overall, I give this like a 4 of 10 for how likely it is, but probably an 8 of 10 for how great it could be, making it the underrated gem of the entire list. Getting really obscure now, there used to be a people in modern-day southwest Iran called the Elamites, a civilization which developed in parallel with the Sumerian and later Mesopotamian peoples, but is largely forgotten nowadays, partly because so little is known of them. The biggest hurdle to them making it into the game is how far away they are from the already announced map. Basically, the only way they would show up is potentially in a Mesopotamia-focused map or map expansion. And even then, it isn't guaranteed. I mean, on one hand, they did sack Babylon right at the tail end of the period in Total War Pharaoh, so they are players in the region to a certain extent, but at the same time, they're tucked away in some pretty distant mountains, making them fairly out of the way. And despite what you read in Genesis 14, they never went conquering out past Mesopotamia, so they haven't got much plausible interaction with our core factions in Egypt and Anatolia. Still, they do have a place on a Mesopotamia map, and are an underappreciated civilization overall. So they do have a chance, maybe 3 of 10, for ever appearing. That said, I'm honestly only about 2 of 10 excited for playing them, partly because their geography makes them inconvenient, and partly because, I don't know, Elam never really grabbed me the way their neighbors did, but that's ultimately a super subjective feeling. Maybe other folks are more excited for some pre-Persian action. Now, Nubia is already in the game, currently conquered by Amun-Mesa down at the south end of the map. However, it's entirely possible that they could push the map a bit further south, because there are more Nubians down there. And if they get far enough, they could include parts of modern-day Ethiopia, and maybe even Yemen, which collectively are the region anciently known as Kush. There is civilization down here, and it would be cool to see it and have trade or naval expeditions going up and down the Red Sea. But honestly, it's pretty far south for a map that's already really long on the north-south axis. The advantage of most of these factions we've already looked at is that by going east or west, you don't have to add so much to overall travel times. But if they were to head south into deeper Africa, it could start to become quite a slog to get armies from one part of the map to another, and I could see them avoiding this region purely for that reason. Also, historically, the further south you go, the less significant cultural interaction you get with the Near East. There were trade flows and cultural exchanges, but this isn't total cultural exchange, it's total war. And the Egyptian borders they already have represent pretty much the southern extreme of the Egyptian Empire for some pretty strong logistical reasons. The pharaohs didn't go further south largely because they couldn't, and independent Nubians can far more easily be represented by barbarian armies walking in off the edge of the map, much like all the other threats. Because of this, I would rate this only a 2 of 10 in terms of likeliness, and a 4 of 10 for excitement, because while it would be a cool region, it would also likely be a bit overextended for most players to have to deal with both Kush and, say, North Egypt or Canaan in the same game. The final nation on this list is the least likely, and probably the most controversial. Around this time, according to the narratives found in the Bible, Moses should be wandering the desert, leading a bunch of escaped Egyptian ex-slaves, and soon enough his successor Joshua should be leading an army across the River Jordan. Now, I won't go into all the details, because pretty much every part of that is controversial, often in multiple ways. I do go into all the details in the main Oldest Stories podcast, link below, but for now it's enough to say that some think none of these things ever happened, many think they look quite different from the biblical narrative, and some think it happened at a different historical period, and of course some are very, 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 very attached to the literal word of the Bible. There is, I think, a fair bit of demand for people who would love to take the role of tribal Israel and turn them into judges or monarchy period Israel, but at the same time, many of those people have extremely strongly held and radically opposing ideas of what this should look like. There are historical controversies for sure, it's like around the 19th dynasty or other aspects of Near Eastern history, and Creative Assembly has picked the approach they prefer in those cases and just run with it. But for what should be obvious reasons, the heat around Israel-based disagreements is vastly hotter. Because of that, even though we can imagine what it should look like, I would give Israel a 1 of 10 chance of ever actually appearing in the game. Not a 0 chance, because it would get them a relatively large amount of attention and name recognition, but also pretty close to 0. If they come in as anything like a Joshua army, now I would give that a 7 of 10 for how excited I am for that, but with a big ol' asterisk by that score. Because if they pick one of the interpretations that I don't like, I'm gonna be mortally offended and cry about blasphemy, because the God of all things who created the universe might be absolutely ruined if he's misrepresented in a video game. Anyway, that's the list I came up with. I think pretty much everyone possible got at least a mention, but let me know if I missed anyone. Meanwhile, stick your own lists in the comments, ordering by how much you want to each to appear as a faction in future DLC. And definitely know what you think. More historical stuff is coming up soon when it gets made. Until then, thanks for watching.